You're traveling through the unknown, a journey beyond the corners of reality, where the shadows whisper and the chill runs deep. Welcome to the dimension where your deepest fears are given form. This is The Midnight Mystery.
Welcome to The Midnight Mystery. This episode is called The Last Broadcast. In each episode, we delve into the shadowed corners of our existence, bringing you tales of the eerie, the uncanny, and the downright terrifying. From the realms of the supernatural to the depths of the human psyche, no stone is left unturned, no dark secret left hidden. Welcome to the weekend special episode where we have 3 short horror stories for you. The Haunted Hotel, The Last Broadcast, and The Tunnel. As the clock once again draws near midnight, prepare to embark on another adventure into the uncanny, the eerie, the horrifying, the midnight mystery. I'm currently sitting in room 204, huddled on the edge of a faded velvet chair. The yellow glow from a flickering lamp dimly illuminates the antique desk before me. My laptop is open, a microphone set up before me. My trembling hands hover over the keyboard, unsure of where to start. "Hey, are you recording already?" asks my friend Alice as she peeks into the room, her pale face paler still under the dim light. I nod, and she walks in, wrapping herself in the thick drapes. The room is eerily cold despite it being the middle of June. "I hope someone believes us," she says, her voice a mere whisper. I try to offer her a comforting smile, but I'm not sure it reaches my eyes. It was supposed to be an escape, a wild adventure, a group of 5 friends driving across the country, exploring forgotten towns, devouring mouth-watering local cuisine, and creating memories to last a lifetime. We had no idea that the greatest memory we would make would be our own entrapment. Not in a city, not in a state, but in a hotel, an entity alive and menacing in its own right. The first time we saw it, standing alone off the highway like a brooding monolith, we laughed. Its grand Victorian architecture, complete with ornate carvings and towering spires, seemed out of place amidst the backdrop of barren fields and open skies. I remember James, our resident history enthusiast, marveling at the craftsmanship, eager to explore what lay within. "Well, folks, looks like we've hit the jackpot," he'd exclaimed, grinning widely as we all piled out of our van. Alice, always the adventurous one, rushed towards it, her excitement infectious. We thought it would be a quirky, fun anecdote to share once we got back home. A night spent in a hotel seemingly misplaced in time. "This place is amazing!" Alice had cried, spinning in the grand entrance. Sarah and Mike, the couple of our group, had been less impressed, Sarah grimacing at the dust, and Mike noting the lack of cell reception. I remember brushing their concerns off, enchanted by the old-world charm of the place. From the moment we checked in, a subtle unease crept over us. The receptionist, a woman with gray hair tied into a neat bun and wrinkles that spoke of a long life, greeted us with a forced smile. There was something disconcerting about the way her gaze was fixed on something far beyond our presence. "Welcome to the Ravensbrook Hotel," she said, her voice a dry rasp echoing in the lofty foyer. "I hope you'll find your stay enlightening." Alice, with her charming spirit, had tried to engage her in conversation. "You must have some great stories about this place," she'd said with a friendly smile. But the receptionist had only responded with a strange smirk, her eyes never quite meeting ours. As night fell, the hotel seemed to take on a life of its own. The echoing silence of the day gave way to distant whispers, doors creaking, and the faint strains of a piano playing a haunting melody. The layout, which we had navigated with ease earlier, turned into a labyrinth of shadows. Corridors spiraled into the unknown, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. Rooms that we had just walked past would vanish, replaced by solid walls or new doors that opened to other bizarre hallways. We first took it as a joke, a product of tired minds and too many horror movies. Mike even made us laugh with his impression of a TV ghost hunter. "What we're experiencing here, folks, is a classic case of phantom architecture," he'd said, his flashlight under his chin for effect. But as the night grew darker and the strangeness escalated, laughter was replaced by a sense of gnawing dread. James, always the logical one, was the first to voice the fear that had crept into our hearts. "This is not a trick," he'd said, his voice barely a whisper. "The hotel, it's changing." And in the silence that followed, we all knew he was right. The grand, misplaced Victorian hotel was not just a building, it was a shape-shifting entity, reshaping itself, playing with us like a cat with its prey. The other guests, if we could even call them that, were an additional layer of dread to our already terrifying predicament. Their hollow eyes followed our every move. Their gaunt faces remained expressionless, only enhancing our sense of unease. "They're not real," Sarah murmured once, her eyes wide as she observed an old man in Victorian attire shuffling past our table in the dining hall. "I mean, they're there but not really there, you know?" She turned to us, her face as pale as the spectral guests that filled the room. "Like ghosts." Mike's voice trailed off, and we all nodded in chilling understanding. This hotel was not merely haunted, it was a purgatory, an amalgamation of time and space filled with trapped souls. And now, we were among them. Our growing realization of our grim predicament sparked a primal need to escape. Desperation laced every thought, every action. We gathered at the grand double doors of the hotel, the same doors we had entered with such light-hearted spirits not too long ago. "I can't stand another second in here!" Sarah cried out, fear etching lines of distress on her usually calm face. "There has to be a way out! This is a hotel, not a prison!" James added, his logical mind still struggling to make sense of the supernatural nightmare we were living. The sign overhead bore the word "Exit," a mocking promise of freedom. But when we pushed the doors open, our hopeful faces fell as we were greeted not by the open world, but by another endless, dimly lit corridor. Its walls, adorned with faded tapestries and gaslight sconces, seemed to stretch on infinitely, leading us back into the heart of the hotel's twisted labyrinth. "How is this possible?" Mike murmured, his voice echoing in the hollow expanse. The fear in his eyes was mirrored in each of us. Every door we tried gave the same result: a new hallway, a new staircase, another part of the hotel we hadn't seen before. Like a cruel game, the hotel was leading us deeper into its belly, mocking our futile attempts to escape. In despair, we turned our attention to the grand windows lining the lobby. Daylight streamed through them, a cruel mirage of the freedom that was mere feet away yet felt like miles. Together we threw ourselves against them, hoping to shatter the glass and leap to freedom. Our efforts were rewarded with nothing but bruised bodies and shattered hope. The windows, previously clear panes of glass, now felt solid, like walls of unyielding concrete. Our fists, our bodies, even a heavy iron candlestick did nothing but bounce off harmlessly. The world outside, once within our reach, was now nothing more than a taunting scene painted onto an impenetrable barrier. Every attempt to leave, every hope of escape, was thwarted by the malevolent hotel. It was as if the building itself was alive, relishing in our despair, feeding off our fear. The hotel wasn't just trapping us, it was breaking us, showing us the futility of our resistance. But still, we were not ready to surrender. Trapped and terrified we were, but defeated we were not. Alice, always the resilient one, tried to boost our spirits. "We just need to find the right door," she insisted. But even her voice lacked its usual vigor, a testament to the hopeless situation we were in. So here we were, stuck in a perpetually altering labyrinth, a hotel from a time long past, surrounded by ghostly apparitions. We thought we were just guests. We didn't realize we were becoming the hotel's newest permanent residents, until we found the newspaper. James discovered it tucked away in a decrepit study, hidden under layers of dust. The date of our check-in was on the front page, but the year was decades earlier. There was an article about a car crash, a fatal one. A group of friends on a cross-country road trip had died. Their names were our names. The horrifying truth sank in as we read the article, the paper shaking in our hands. We didn't make it to the hotel, did we?" Alice asked, her voice a trembling whisper. I looked into the terrified eyes of my friends, their faces now matching the pale, hollow faces of the other guests. In a library that appeared one morning at the end of a previously dead-end corridor, we found a stack of old newspapers. The musty smell of aged paper filled the room, the once luxurious bookshelves now home to forgotten knowledge and unvisited stories. James was the one who made the discovery, his hands shaking as he showed us the headline. This isn't right," he stammered, holding out the newspaper. The top one bore the date of our check-in, but the year was several decades past. The headline was a cold, brutal stab of reality. "Fatal car crash claims 5 friends on cross-country road trip." We crowded around, each of us reading over the other's shoulder, eyes skimming the lines in disbelief. The report detailed a horrific car crash. The car was ours. The road was the same one we had traveled on our way to the hotel. "Remember the truck? The one we joked about?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "We laughed about how close it had come. We were sure we avoided it." Mike pulled her close, his face pale, his eyes reflecting the terrifying realization that dawned on us. "Only, we hadn't avoided it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. One by one, we fell into a stunned silence, each of us wrestling with the undeniable truth. We had died that day on the road. The hotel, the strange guests, the unescapable corridors, none of it was real. Or rather, it wasn't part of the living world. It was our afterlife, our personal purgatory. We're dead," Alice said after a long silence, the words sounding foreign and unimaginable. "We're the ghosts." Her words hung in the air like a chilling prophecy, a tragic end to our adventurous journey. And so, I sit here, broadcasting our story from room 204, the room that has become our anchor in this shifting, spectral world. The microphone in front of me seems almost out of place, a vestige from a life that seems both so close and yet impossibly far away. "Is it recording?" Alice asks, breaking the silence that has enveloped the room. "Yes," I nod, my voice barely a whisper. "Good. Let's tell our story," she says, her voice echoing the determination I can see in her eyes. So, we begin, our voices weaving the tale of our unexpected journey into the afterlife. We speak of the joy of our road trip, the allure of the grand Victorian hotel, the horror that slowly unveiled itself. We speak of our discovery, the chilling realization, the acceptance of our fateful end. Remember, if you see an inviting Victorian hotel standing alone off a highway, Alice's voice echoes into the microphone, think of us, and keep driving. We can only hope our words permeate the ethereal barrier that seems to encase this hotel. Reach out to someone in the living world. If by some miracle you're listening to this, heed our warning. The hotel is not what it seems. It's a trap, a purgatory for lost souls like us. For us, it's too late. We are the very entities that we feared when we first stepped into this hotel. We are part of the haunting, condemned to roam these shifting corridors for eternity. If you're listening to this, remember our story, remember our names, and if you ever find yourself checking into a grand Victorian hotel standing alone off a highway, take a moment, look around, listen for the faint echoes of our laughter, look for the remnants of our existence. Who knows? Perhaps you might find that you're not merely a guest in the hotel. Perhaps you too are a part of the haunting. The irony is not lost on us. We came to live an adventure, only to become a ghost story ourselves. We are the ghosts we feared. We are a part of the haunted hotel. If you're listening to this, who knows? Perhaps you are too. Alex Thompson wasn't always the host of a popular true crime podcast. He had begun his career as an investigative journalist. Born and raised in the city of New Haven, Alex had always been fascinated by mysteries, largely fueled by his mother's collection of Agatha Christie novels. His knack for asking the right questions and his insatiable curiosity made journalism an ideal career path. He worked his way up from a local reporter covering mundane town events to an investigative journalist for the New Haven Chronicle. His big break came when he unmasked a high-profile corruption scandal within the city government. He was relentless, chasing leads and piecing together a puzzle that most didn't even realize existed. His work earned him not just accolades, but also a reputation for being unafraid to dive into the city's underbelly. Despite his success, the world of print journalism was dwindling, with digital media offering a more immediate and visceral connection with the audience. It was during this period that Alex discovered the growing world of podcasts. A new form of storytelling, it offered a unique platform to bring his passion for investigative journalism to a broader audience. He launched Voices in the Dark, a late-night true crime and mystery podcast, to delve into unsolved mysteries and cold cases. It was an instant hit. His listeners loved his soothing voice, his thoughtful narration, and the eerie thrill of unraveling real-life mysteries. It was like being in a detective's mind, sifting through clues and speculations, challenging assumptions and questioning the unexplained. Alex found the transition from journalism to podcasting a challenging yet satisfying journey. Podcasting was a different beast, requiring him to not just investigate, but also entertain. He was the researcher, the storyteller, and the voice that connected the tale to the listeners. He took to the task with fervor, constantly improving his delivery, pacing, and narrative style. Despite the switch in mediums, Alex's goal remained the same: to uncover the truth. He took pride in giving a voice to victims whose stories hadn't found closure, serving a virtual congregation of true crime enthusiasts, and shedding light on unresolved mysteries. Yet, as his audience grew, so did an underlying sense of dread. He was stirring the pot, bringing forgotten horrors back into public consciousness. There was always the fear of retaliation, but Alex was a journalist at heart. He believed in his work, and that belief was enough to keep him going, even as the voices in the dark grew closer. Tonight, dear listeners, we traverse the cold, haunting memories of our city. Memories of a time of fear, when darkness fell not just on our streets but our hearts, as we lived under the shadow of a predator lurking amongst us, the Moonlight Sonata Killer. Alex's voice echoed through the podcast. The Moonlight Sonata Killer emerged from the depths of the city's shadows, a faceless entity whose reign of terror lasted for 2 grueling years. From 2018 to 2020, New Haven lived in a perpetual state of fear, as the serial killer claimed one victim after another, leaving behind a chilling signature: an earpiece playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. What began as an isolated, gruesome murder gradually transformed into a horrifying pattern that gripped the city. The victims varied in age, gender, and socioeconomic status. The only commonality, aside from their untimely death, was the classical sonata playing in their ears and the full moon that hung high on the night of their demise. Alex vividly remembered reporting on the first murder. A 32-year-old schoolteacher, Amanda Clark, was found in her home, an eerie melody flowing from the earpiece set snugly in her ear. She was the first, but not the last. Over 2 years, 12 victims fell prey to this faceless murderer. The city was under siege, the police under unprecedented pressure, and the citizens locked their doors once the sun set, dread pooling in their hearts as moonlight washed over New Haven. Perhaps the most bone-chilling aspect of these murders was not just the ghastly scene that met the investigators, but the fact that there was no apparent struggle. It was as though the victims were in a trance, willingly following their killer, entranced by the haunting melody of the Moonlight Sonata. Alex continued, an edge to his voice. The police were initially optimistic about the case. The killer's calling card was distinctive, the pattern specific. But it soon became apparent that these clues led nowhere. There were no fingerprints, no trace of DNA, no surveillance footage, and no witnesses. As if the killer was a ghost, disappearing with the moonlight, only to reappear on the next full moon. The breakthrough everyone had hoped for never came. The murders abruptly stopped in the fall of 2020, the killer vanishing as mysteriously as they had appeared. The Moonlight Sonata Killer was never identified, the case eventually going cold, leaving behind a city scarred and a dozen families mourning. And so, Alex's voice dropped to a whisper. Despite all our advancements, our digital surveillance, DNA forensics, and dedicated detectives, the Moonlight Sonata Killer remains a phantom, a chilling reminder of our vulnerability and the questions that haunt us. Who was behind these monstrous acts? Why did they stop? And most importantly, where are they now? Alex paused, the silence punctuated only by the soft strains of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata playing in the background. Perhaps some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved, echoing in our memories, like a haunting melody in the dark. As Beethoven's sonata faded away, Alex opened the lines for calls. He was met with the usual mix of theories and fears, the shared fascination and dread for the night's subject. Just as he was about to wrap up the session, a call came through. "Hello, Alex." The caller's voice was calm, collected, a stark contrast to the uneasy callers that had come before him. "Let's call me John Doe." "Well, hello, John Doe. I'm glad you called in. What are your thoughts on the Moonlight Sonata Killer?" Alex asked, intrigued by the man's composure. John's insights were unlike any Alex had heard. He spoke about the killer's choice of Beethoven's sonata, how it was more than a signature. but a symbol of the killer's sophistication and his psychological state. He discussed how the moon was not just a schedule, but a symbolic ally for the killer, suggesting a deeper connection with lunar cycles. John's words seemed to dissect the cold case with an unusual precision, an intimate understanding that both intrigued and unnerved Alex. He had spoken to many analysts, criminologists, and psychologists on his show, but never had he encountered a caller whose understanding of a serial killer seemed so immersive. The listeners were equally enthralled. Messages flooded in, praising John Doe's analysis, asking for more insights. The social media buzzed with speculation about John Doe's identity, some even wildly guessing him to be a retired detective or a criminology professor. By the end of the night, #John Doe was trending, and so began the fascinating yet eerie interaction with John Doe. Each call shed more light on the elusive Moonlight Sonata killer, his methods, his likely psychology, and even theories about why he might have stopped. Every new revelation seemed to peel back a layer, drawing the listeners further into the chilling labyrinth. Alex, too, was hooked. While John Doe's insights sometimes sent chills down his spine, his journalist's curiosity was piqued. Each call felt like an enigma, a challenge to his investigative skills. Who was John Doe? How did he possess such detailed knowledge about a cold case? But despite his best efforts, Alex came up empty-handed. The intrigue surrounding John Doe grew with each call. The listeners, too, became obsessed with the mystery caller. The podcast's ratings soared, as did the theories around John Doe's identity. Some listeners even speculated about John's uncanny understanding of the Moonlight Sonata killer, darkly hinting at the possibility of him being the killer. However, amidst the rising popularity and speculation, a chilling unease snaked its way into Alex's heart. The thought was absurd, he told himself, shaking off the unsettling feeling. After all, why would a notorious serial killer call into a podcast? But as Alex was about to discover, the world of crime and horror was often stranger than fiction. Little did he know that his pursuit of truth would lead him down a dangerous path, where the voice in the dark would become a harbinger of his worst nightmares. John Doe became a recurring character on Voices in the Dark. The episodes featuring his calls became the most anticipated ones, each call adding another layer to the enigma. John Doe's insights went beyond the Moonlight Sonata killer. He shared his thoughts on other cold cases, too, his understanding of the criminal mind consistently surprising Alex and his audience. However, as the weeks rolled on, John's insights began to take a darker turn. His tone, once analytical, began to have an unsettling edge. He spoke about the killers not as separate entities, but as individuals who were misunderstood, driven by urges that ordinary people couldn't fathom. He began describing crime scenes with a disconcerting attention to detail, as though he was present, soaking in the horror and the thrill of it all. The change in John was subtle, but enough to put Alex on edge. The unsettling undercurrents in John's calls and the nagging question of his identity led Alex to contact the local police. He shared his recordings, hoping they could provide insight or even identify the mysterious caller. But despite their best efforts, they came up empty-handed. They found no match for the voice, and John Doe had done an excellent job of covering his digital tracks. Undeterred, Alex reached out to a cybercrime unit, hoping they could trace John's calls. Once again, his attempts were fruitless. Whoever John Doe was, he was meticulous and well-versed in masking his identity. Each dead end only fueled Alex's fascination and apprehension. There was a disconcerting feeling of being watched, of being drawn into a game he didn't understand. His journalistic instincts were at war with his growing fear. Each ring of the phone brought a rush of anticipation and a pang of dread. Would it be John? What would he reveal this time? During his investigation into John Doe, Alex started receiving anonymous emails. They contained snippets of information about unsolved cases, pieces of a puzzle that seemed to point towards a larger, darker web. They were all signed with the same chilling sign-off, from the shadows, John Doe. As the days bled into weeks, Alex found himself caught in an insidious web spun by his enigmatic caller. His once exciting podcast had transformed into a nightmarish reality, the voices in the dark becoming all too real. The fear was slowly but surely creeping in, tainting his once beloved work with a sense of impending doom. Even his audience began picking up on the change. The messages flooded in, split between concern for Alex and an insatiable curiosity about John Doe. The theories became wilder, darker, mirroring the growing unease. The podcast had always been about true crime, but now it seemed true crime had infiltrated the podcast. Despite the rising terror, Alex remained committed to uncovering John Doe's identity. He was a journalist at heart, and his pursuit of truth outweighed his fear. He was determined to unravel this mystery, even as the lines between the hunter and the hunted began to blur. Determined to unmask John Doe, Alex began his investigation parallel to the calls. His small home office was soon a testament to his growing obsession. A web of notes and pictures, maps marking cold case locations, and timelines pinned to the corkboard. Alex pored over old case files, hunting for a clue, a connection that could link John Doe to the chilling crimes discussed in his podcast. He listened and re-listened to John's calls, dissecting each word, each nuance in his voice. He went over his tips to the police, the insights John had provided, looking for any detail that might point to his identity. He spent countless hours at the local library, poring over old newspapers, tracing the city's history, delving into old unsolved cases. His conversations with retired cops, former journalists, and victims' families painted a disturbing picture, yet offered no concrete leads. Alex began noticing a few threads that connected some unsolved cases, a similar modus operandi, an overlapping timeline, and victims with shared traits. He compiled a list of these linked cases, some of which were crimes John had spoken about. However, it was an offhand remark by an old beat cop about a victim who loved classical music that caught his attention. She was a pianist who was known to practice late into the night, her favorite piece being the Moonlight Sonata. Alex felt a chill run down his spine as he realized this victim's case coincided with the timeline of the Moonlight Sonata killer. Alongside the investigation, Alex started experiencing strange occurrences. There were times he felt watched, an unsettling prickling at the back of his neck. Late at night, he heard odd noises, soft footsteps outside his house, the faint echo of a melody that he thought was the wind, but sounded hauntingly similar to Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. He found objects in his house slightly misplaced. His notes shuffled, a mug moved, his laptop screen left open on a case file. Each incident could have been brushed off as forgetfulness, but together, they filled Alex with a dreadful certainty that he wasn't alone. As the evidence piled up, the line between paranoia and reality began to blur. Alex's once mundane life was now tinged with a sense of dread. The suspicion that John Doe might be closer than he imagined turned his world into a terrifying chessboard, where he felt more like a pawn than a player, but the fear didn't deter him. If anything, it steeled his resolve. He was Alex Thompson, the man who had faced corruption and crime head-on. He wouldn't be deterred by a faceless voice, however chilling it might be. Armed with his investigative skills and a stubborn streak, Alex vowed to unmask John Doe, to drag him into the light from the shadows where he lurked. Little did he know, the shadows were deeper and darker than he imagined. Absolutely. Let's delve into this chilling turning point. The day was stormy, a portentous gloom hanging over the city. As Alex arrived at his studio, a package sat ominously on his desk, wrapped in plain brown paper, no return address, no distinguishing marks. Just a box and his name, written in a neat, unfamiliar hand. A cold dread slithered its way into Alex's gut as he stared at the box. His mind immediately raced to the gruesome symbol of the Moonlight Sonata killer, the headphones. Was this his sick way of claiming his next victim? He stood frozen for a moment, the room oppressively silent, save for the rain lashing against the window. His eyes remained glued to the package, 1,000 questions buzzing in his head. Finally, with a shaky breath, he moved to open it. Alex felt his heartbeat in his throat as he slowly unwrapped the package, the air thick with tension. The box creaked open, revealing nothing. It was empty. Alex blinked at the emptiness, his heart pounding in his chest, a rush of relief washing over him. His relief, however, was short-lived. His gaze fell on the inside of the box, where Moonlight Sonata was written in the same neat handwriting. The box was a message, a terrifying declaration from the killer himself. The Moonlight Sonata killer was playing a game, and Alex was his chosen adversary. His mind echoed with John Doe's chilling voice, his cryptic comments, his unnerving knowledge about the killer. The pieces of the terrifying puzzle were falling into place, their picture far more horrifying than Alex had ever imagined. As the reality of his situation sank in, fear coiled around Alex like a shroud. He was no longer just a podcaster or a journalist seeking truth. He was a part of the narrative, the next chapter in the chilling saga of the Moonlight Sonata killer. The voices in the dark had become a stark reality, a reality Alex was unprepared for, but he had no choice but to confront it. As he sat in his studio, the echo of Moonlight Sonata playing in his mind, Alex knew he was in the sights of a predator, his life hanging by a thread. It was another night of voices in the dark, a night that would become the most haunting in Alex's life. The topic of the evening was the recent discovery related to the Moonlight Sonata killer, the chilling message delivered through the empty box. Alex started the live session, his voice steady despite the underlying tension. He recounted the eerie events, the package, and the chilling message it contained. The atmosphere was heavy, a sense of anticipation pervading the airwaves. As the discussion evolved, the familiar voice echoed through the line. "Hello, Alex." The voice made Alex's blood run cold. "John Doe." John's voice held an edge that night, a thinly veiled menace. "You know, Alex, I've always admired your work, your dedication to unmasking the truth. But did you ever wonder about the cost?" Alex frowned, a chill running down his spine. "What do you mean, John? You see, in this dance of ours we've become intertwined. Your pursuit of truth, my pursuit of perfection. We're two sides of the same coin, Alex." The line crackled with ominous silence. John's words hung in the air, their implications slowly dawning on Alex. A terrifying realization gripped him. John Doe was the Moonlight Sonata killer. Before Alex could respond, John continued. "Your dedication to this game has been admirable, Alex. I'm impressed. So much so that I feel it's time we met face to face." Alex's heart pounded in his chest. What are you saying, John?" There was a dark chuckle on the other end. "I'm saying, Alex, I'll be seeing you very soon." The call ended abruptly, leaving Alex in a stunned silence. His heart raced, his mind in turmoil. John Doe, the intriguing caller, was the Moonlight Sonata killer. The man who had been terrorizing the city for years was the same man who had been speaking with him, sharing insights, playing a deadly game that Alex was unknowingly a part of. His studio, once a sanctuary of stories and truths, now felt like a stage set for a horrifying confrontation. The realization that he was not just chasing a story, but was now a part of it, was a hard pill to swallow. John Doe's final call had set the stage for a chilling climax. As Alex sat in his studio, the silence amplifying his pounding heartbeat, he understood the grave danger he was in. The voices in the dark were not just stories anymore, they were a chilling reality. And he was at the epicenter, waiting for the arrival of a killer. Alex was on autopilot as he tried to wrap up the podcast. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me on Voices in the Dark. Be safe out there." His voice was shaking, and he quickly switched off the live feed, his hands trembling. In a panic, he fumbled for his phone, his fingers hastily typing in the emergency number. He had to alert the police, had to let them know that the killer was on his way. But before he could press dial, a slow, haunting creak echoed through the room. Alex froze, his blood turning to ice as the familiar sound of the studio door reached his ears. Slowly, he turned around, his heart pounding in his chest, the blood roaring in his ears. Standing in the doorway was a figure, silhouetted against the dim light filtering in from the hallway. "Hello, Alex," a voice echoed, the same voice that had haunted him for weeks, the voice of John Doe. Alex's breath hitched as he stared at the man before him. "John," he whispered, his voice barely a croak. John chuckled, a chilling sound that made Alex's skin crawl. "Finally, we meet face to face," he said, slowly stepping into the room, the door closing behind him with a haunting thud. Alex was paralyzed with fear, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. He watched as John approached him, a predator closing in on its prey. John Doe was just as ordinary as his pseudonym suggested, an average man that you'd pass on the street without a second glance. But the cold smile on his face, the maniacal glint in his eyes, they told a different story. Without another word, John lunged at Alex, his movements swift and decisive. Alex didn't even have time to react. One moment he was standing, staring at the man he had unknowingly invited into his life, and the next, he was on the ground, his vision blurring, a searing pain in his neck. As his lifeblood drained away, Alex saw John pick up the empty box from the desk, a sadistic smile playing on his lips. The last thing Alex felt was his head being lifted, and then darkness. His eyes, once full of curiosity and intelligence, now held a lifeless gaze, their last sight being the box that had served as the precursor to his end. His head was placed gently into the box, a grotesque end to the terrifying game. John Doe stood in the now silent studio, the lifeless body of Alex Thompson at his feet. The once bustling podcast studio, the platform for the voice of truth, had turned into a gruesome crime scene, the final chapter of Voices in the Dark. "Good night, Alex," John murmured, a chilling farewell to the man who had unknowingly become his latest victim. The lights of the studio flickered out, plunging the room into darkness, the echo of Moonlight Sonata serving as a haunting lullaby. The final episode of Voices in the Dark had come to an end, and with it, the life of Alex Thompson. In his pursuit of truth, he had gotten too close to the darkness and paid the ultimate price. The silence that followed was a chilling testament to the terror of the Moonlight Sonata killer, a haunting melody that would echo through the city for years to come. Every morning since Laura's death, I woke up to an empty space in my bed. The place where my wife used to be was now a cold reminder of our lost love. I missed her voice, her laughter, her way of making everything better. But life was not so merciful. It was me and our little boy now. "Daddy, when will Mommy come back?" Billy would often ask, his innocent eyes wide and hopeful. It always twisted my heart into a painful knot. "She's watching over us from the stars, Billy," I'd answer, trying to keep my voice steady. "She's always with us." Billy was a spitting image of Laura. His bright blue eyes and sandy blonde hair were hers. Even his laughter had the same contagious magic that hers used to. Every time I looked at him, it was like seeing her. It was both heartbreaking and comforting. I decided to be the best parent I could. Not just a father, but a mother too. I knew Billy, every bit of him. I knew how he scrunched his nose when he ate broccoli, and how his eyes lit up when I read him stories of adventure and nights before bed. "Daddy," he'd say, wriggling in his dinosaur print pajamas, "I want to be brave, just like the knights." "And you will be, Billy," I'd reply, tucking him in. "You already are." With each day, I learned something new about him, and with every bedtime story, every shared laugh, every wiped tear, our bond strengthened. One sunny morning, as I watched Billy quietly doodle at the breakfast table, I realized he needed something more, something other than the confines of our home, which still echoed with Laura's absence. An idea popped into my head. "Billy," I said, "how about we go to the park today?" His eyes sparkled with excitement, and the doodle was quickly forgotten. "Really? The one with the big slide and swings? That's the one?" A day at our favorite park seemed like the perfect diversion. It was a place full of fond memories, where Billy could run and laugh, and we could have a few moments of normalcy. As we prepared for the day, I watched Billy carefully select his favorite Superman shirt and blue shorts. There was a skip in his step, a lightness that had been missing for a while. "Ready, champ?" I asked, tying his shoelaces. He gave me a wide, toothy grin. "Ready, Daddy?" Driving to the park, I glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his face pressed against the window, eyes drinking in the outside world. It reminded me of our car rides with Laura. She would sing along to the radio, her laughter filling the car while Billy clapped along in his car seat. I sighed, the memory bittersweet, then reached back to ruffle Billy's hair, mirroring his smile. Our day at the park awaited us, a chance to make new memories, to move forward while cherishing the past, a day filled with the promise of laughter and adventure. "Daddy," Billy's voice piped up from the back seat, "do you think Mommy can see us?" I took a deep breath, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Yes, Billy. She's watching us, and she wants us to be happy." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. "Then let's have a lot of fun today, so Mommy can see us being happy." The park greeted us with its familiar vibrancy, children running wild and free, the aroma of food wafting from the picnic area, and the steady rhythm of the nearby basketball game creating a comforting symphony. It was the essence of life, pure, unfiltered, and infectious. We kicked off our day with a game of catch, a frisbee serving as our shared token of joy. Billy's laughter filled the air as he missed a particularly tricky throw. "Dad, that's not fair," he squealed, the mock pout on his face dissolving into more giggles. "We'll see about that, champ," I chuckled, throwing the frisbee a little gentler this time. He caught it with a triumphant grin and promptly sent it spiraling back my way. After a hearty session of catch, we moved on to our picnic spread. Billy was a particularly picky eater, but I had mastered the art of crafting a menu that would have him finishing his plate without complaint. "Billy, no running off until you finish your sandwich," I warned him, handing him a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, his favorite. "I know, Dad," he replied, rolling his eyes, a hint of Laura in the gesture. But he sat down obediently, munching on his sandwich and looking around at the other kids playing nearby. Once our lunch was done, Billy, renewed with energy, suggested a game of hide-and-seek. Agreeing to his proposal, I began counting, listening to the crunch of gravel under his shoes fade into the distance. Once I had counted to 20, I opened my eyes and began searching for him. I looked behind our usual tree, checked the restrooms, the playground, behind the swings, but Billy was nowhere to be found. A trickle of worry began to creep into my mind, but I brushed it aside, telling myself he had just found a really good hiding spot this time. But as minutes turned into hours, and there was still no sign of Billy, the trickle of worry turned into a torrent of panic. I began to approach other families, asking them if they had seen Billy. Descriptions of his Superman shirt and his sandy blonde hair tumbled out of my mouth as I desperately scanned the park. "I'm sorry, I haven't seen him," most replied. Some even offered to help look for him, their faces creased with worry. But as the park began to empty out, and the sun dipped lower in the sky, Billy was still missing. The bright sunny park seemed to grow darker and more ominous by the second. I could feel my heartbeat thrumming in my ears, each thump echoing my growing fear. My Billy, my little boy, was missing, and I felt helpless. My heart pounded in my chest like a wild drum, my hands trembling as I fumbled to unlock my phone. The park was closing, the sun was setting, and my little boy was still missing. Panic seeped into every corner of my mind. The once vibrant playground, now bathed in an eerie twilight, seemed to echo my fear. As I scrolled through my contacts to find the local police station's number, something caught my eye, a sight unseen in our numerous trips to the park. An opening, nearly obscured by a cluster of thick bushes. A tunnel. A feeling washed over me, a mix of trepidation and a strange sense of hope. I shoved my phone into my pocket, my eyes never leaving the entrance of the tunnel. Could Billy be there? As I entered the tunnel, the ambient sounds of the park gradually faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence. The air was cooler, carrying a hint of dampness that left a chill running down my spine. I fumbled for the flashlight on my phone, the tunnel swallowing up the remaining daylight. The beam of light from my phone cast elongated shadows along the tunnel's wall. It was empty, devoid of any human presence. The further I ventured, the more my hope began to wane. Until I saw him. Lying on the ground, tucked into a corner of the tunnel, was Billy. He was unconscious, but appeared unharmed. I fell to my knees, relief washing over me like a wave. "Billy!" I croaked out, my voice echoing around the hollow space. I reached out, brushing a few stray locks of hair from his forehead. His skin was cool to touch, but he was breathing, the steady rise and fall of his chest a comforting rhythm in the unnerving silence. "Billy, wake up," I pleaded, gently shaking his shoulders, but he remained unresponsive, lost in a deep slumber. "It's okay, I've got you," I reassured myself more than him, scooping him up in my arms. As I retraced my steps out of the tunnel, carrying my unconscious son, a sense of unease coiled in my stomach. The tunnel, the circumstances of Billy's disappearance, his unconscious state, none of it added up. The smile he had worn that morning, his laughter still echoing in my ears, everything felt like a distant dream. Back at the car, I secured Billy in his seat, his head lolling onto his shoulder. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the tunnel, a silent spectator to my worst fears and eventual relief. There was a chill in the air, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake off. As I drove us home, the city lights blinked into existence, casting long shadows along the deserted streets. Billy was still asleep, his chest rising and falling rhythmically. I reached out, gently brushing my fingers through his hair. "It's going to be okay, champ," I whispered, more to myself than him. "We're going home." We pulled up into the driveway, our home a comforting sight amidst the turmoil of the day. The lights inside were warm and inviting, a beacon of safety. Still, the eerie quietness of Billy weighed heavily on me. As I unbuckled him from his seat, his eyes fluttered open, the usual spark in his gaze replaced with an uncharacteristic dullness. "Hey, champ," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "We're home." Billy merely blinked, his lips parting as if to say something, but then closing again. He allowed me to carry him into the house, his body limp in my arms. Inside, I settled him onto the couch, tucking a blanket around him. His favorite superhero plushie, a ragged Superman, was clutched tightly in his arms, the only familiar thing about him at that moment. "Billy, are you feeling okay?" I asked, my concern mounting at his continued silence. I was met with a nod, but the lack of his usual chatter was disconcerting. I made him a cup of hot cocoa, hoping the familiar taste might bring some life back into him. "Here, drink this," I said, handing him the mug. He accepted it with a nod, his grip on the handle weak but steady. As he took a sip, I observed him closely. His features were relaxed, his eyes distant. He seemed lost in thought, a far cry from the energetic boy who couldn't sit still. Deciding to give him some space, I went to the kitchen to prepare dinner, keeping a watchful eye on him from the corner of my eye. I made his favorite, spaghetti with meatballs, hoping the familiar aroma might trigger something. "Dinner's ready, Billy," I called out, setting the table. He set down his now empty mug and padded over to the dining table. He sat down, the Superman plushie still clutched in his hand. "Dad," he said, his voice a mere whisper. It was the first time he had spoken since we had found him. "Yes, Billy," I answered, my heart skipping a beat. "Can I go to bed after this?" His voice was small, almost lost amidst the clatter of cutlery. "Of course, champ," I said, ruffling his hair gently. "You've had a long day." As we ate dinner in silence, the reality of the situation started to sink in. My vibrant, cheerful son was replaced with this quiet, almost ethereal version of him. But I convinced myself it was temporary, a result of the traumatic day we had had. Once dinner was done, I helped Billy up to his room, tucking him into bed. His room, adorned with posters of superheroes and planets, usually a hub of his ceaseless energy, felt eerily silent. "Good night, Billy," I said, leaning in to give him a kiss on the forehead. "Good night, Dad," he mumbled, his eyes already drooping shut. I walked out of the room, his soft breathing the only sound in the quiet house. A sense of dread settled over me, the day's events replaying in my mind. As I stared at Billy's closed door, a sinking feeling gnawed at the pit of my stomach. The days that followed Billy's recovery were a quiet whirlwind. I tried to get us back into our routine, but something was decidedly different. It was as if our home, once filled with Billy's vivacious laughter and innocent mischief, was now under the shadow of a chilling silence. Billy no longer devoured his peanut butter and jelly sandwiches with his usual enthusiasm, nor did he squeal in delight when he scored a goal during our backyard soccer games. His laughter, once music to my ears, was now a hollow echo that hung heavily in the air. The eyes that looked at me from across the breakfast table were the same ones I had seen every day for the past 7 years, yet they held an icy coldness that made my skin crawl. I kept telling myself it was the stress, the shock of the traumatic event that had changed him. But my heart knew better. One particular evening, I had just settled into bed, the day's worries weighing heavily on my mind. It was then that I felt a presence, a feeling of being watched. I opened my eyes to find Billy standing by the foot of my bed, his silhouette illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering in through the window. His eyes were fixed on me, his gaze unsettling. He was mumbling something, words that didn't belong to any language I knew. His voice was no longer the soft, childlike tone I was accustomed to. It was deep, resonating with an unknown power, a menacing undercurrent that sent a shiver down my spine. "Billy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't seem to hear me, his eyes unblinking, his chant uninterrupted. I sprang out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. "Billy, what are you doing?" I asked, the reality of the situation hitting me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't my son. This wasn't the Billy I had raised. The boy who loved superheroes and hated broccoli. As if snapping out of a trance, Billy abruptly stopped speaking. He looked at me, his eyes suddenly lucid and brimming with an emotion I couldn't comprehend. "Good night, Dad," he said, his voice returning to the softer tone, but it was devoid of the warmth it once held. With that, he turned around and walked back to his room, leaving me standing in the middle of mine, the echo of his unknown chant lingering in the air. That night, as I lay wide awake, my mind raced with unsettling thoughts. The changes in Billy, his sudden strange behavior, the haunting chant and the unknown language, all of it pointed to something far more sinister than mere post-traumatic stress. As I replayed the events of the past few days, a dreadful realization set in. My son had not come back from the park that day. Something else had taken his place. As the weight of this understanding bore down on me, I was filled with a paralyzing fear and an overpowering resolve. Whatever was happening, I had to get my son back, no matter the cost. Driven by desperation, I began seeking answers. Through online forums and local libraries, I stumbled upon a lead, an expert in local folklore named Eleanor. Her articles about mythical entities and her deep understanding of local legends convinced me that she might be able to shed light on my predicament. I called Eleanor, my hands trembling as I explained my situation. There was a long pause, then a sigh. "This isn't the first time I've heard such a story, John," she said, her voice weighed down with a serious tone. Within the hour, I was sitting in her office, a cozy room filled with stacks of old books and artifacts. A large map of the town was spread across the table, pins and notes marking various significant points. As I narrated my ordeal, from our day at the park to the uncanny transformation of Billy, Eleanor listened intently, her eyes narrowing in thought. Once I finished, she took a deep breath and looked at me, her gaze filled with sympathy and resolve. "John," she began, "I believe what you're dealing with is a changeling." I blinked, taken aback. "A changeling?" I repeated, my mind racing to catch up. Eleanor nodded. "In folklore, a changeling is a monstrous entity that takes the place of a human child. It adopts their form, their identity. But it's not them. It's not your Billy." A cold dread seeped into my veins, but I forced myself to focus. "How do I get Billy back?" I asked, my voice steady despite the panic threatening to consume me. Eleanor pursed her lips, considering. "It's not going to be easy," she warned, "but the first step is to understand that Billy might still be out there. He might be trapped wherever this entity came from." The implications were overwhelming, yet they provided a glimmer of hope. Billy could still be out there, waiting for me to find him. "I'll help you, John," Eleanor promised, her eyes filled with determination. "We're going to get your son back." That night, as I locked up the house, I took a long look at the attic door. I thought of Billy upstairs, asleep in his room, and the real Billy, who was out there somewhere. A newfound resolve filled me. This entity might have fooled others, but it couldn't fool a father's love for his son. I was going to get Billy back, whatever it took. Over the next few days, my determination for answers led me to unearth several unsettling clues. Billy's drawings, which once depicted superheroes and playful scenes, now showcased intricate, otherworldly symbols that made my skin prickle with unease. One day, when Billy was downstairs, I slipped into his room. In the quiet of the space, I discovered something disturbing. Tucked beneath his bed, hidden away from prying eyes, was a collection of small, dead animals. A squirrel, a few birds, their lifeless bodies perfectly preserved, their eyes vacant. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of entity was capable of such gruesome actions, and why? My nights were tormented by nightmares, visions of a haunting realm that seemed both distant and incredibly close. I saw Billy in those dreams, his small figure lost amidst the twisted landscape, his voice calling out to me from the abyss. I would wake up drenched in sweat, his name on my lips, his absence in our home a stark reminder of the reality I was living. One evening, as I was struggling to make sense of the cryptic symbols Billy had been drawing, a sudden thought struck me. Could these symbols be a form of communication? A link between the changeling and its home realm? I took a picture of the drawings and sent them to Eleanor. She called me back almost immediately. "John," she said, her voice filled with urgency, "these symbols, they're not random. They're an ancient language. I can't translate it all, but some of the recurring symbols mean portal, exchange, and equilibrium. The information hit me like a ton of bricks. A portal, an exchange. My mind raced with the possibilities. Could it be that the tunnel at the park was a portal to another world, where Billy was now trapped? Eleanor's voice broke through my thoughts. John, these symbols suggest a connection between the two realms. It's a kind of equilibrium. The changeling was exchanged for Billy. It also suggests that the same portal used to bring the changeling into our world can be used to bring Billy back. A glimmer of hope sparked within me, fueling my resolve. As terrifying as the prospect was, I knew what I had to do. I had to go back to the park, back to the tunnel. I had to get my son back. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind filled with thoughts of strange symbols, hidden portals, and monstrous changelings, I felt a sense of urgency. Every moment I spent in the comfort of my home was a moment Billy spent in a terrifying alien world. No matter how dangerous or terrifying the task was, I would venture into the unknown to save my son. The following day, Eleanor and I spoke at length about how to handle the changeling. She explained that in folklore, one way to make a changeling leave is to make it believe it's unwanted and unloved. The thought of doing this, even to an imposter, was deeply unsettling. Eleanor, I said, my voice shaking, you're asking me to treat this thing, as if it's unwanted, that it's not loved. I don't know if I can do that. John, Eleanor replied, her voice steady and calming, I know this is hard, but remember, this isn't Billy. Your son is somewhere out there, needing his father to come and save him. We're doing this to get Billy back. She was right, but the thought of what I had to do made my stomach churn. That night, I took a deep breath and did the hardest thing I've ever done. I took Billy to the attic, a place he'd never been allowed to go before. I'm sorry, Billy, I said, my voice almost breaking, but you have to stay here for a while. He looked at me, confusion and something resembling fear in his eyes. I hated myself for doing this. I locked the door behind me, the sound echoing in the emptiness of our home. I kept the door locked, going up only to leave food and water. The house filled with the sound of Billy's otherworldly cries. It was an inhuman sound, full of pain and anger, a constant reminder of the monstrous entity within my son. Every wail tested my resolve, gnawing at my heartstrings. At night I would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Billy's cries echoing through the house. This isn't Billy, I would remind myself over and over, trying to drown out the guilt and the fear. You're doing this for Billy. Days passed. The cries from the attic continued, growing louder, more desperate. I found myself speaking to a picture of Billy, explaining to him what I was doing. I'm so sorry, Billy, I'd say, tears streaming down my face. I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this to bring you back. Through it all, I held on to Eleanor's words. This wasn't my son. My Billy was still out there, alone and scared, and I would move heaven and earth to bring him back. On the 7th night, the house was bathed in an unnerving silence. The anguished cries from the attic had finally ceased. My heart pounded in my chest as I ascended the creaking staircase, gripping the cold iron key that unlocked the door to the room where my son's doppelganger was confined. Fear gnawed at the edges of my mind, but I steeled myself, ready to face the aftermath of the unspeakable torment. The dimly lit attic was a landscape of shadows, the only light source a solitary bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling. There, amidst the dusty cardboard boxes and long-forgotten trinkets, lay Billy, motionless and silent, a cruel echo of that day in the tunnel. As I approached, his eyelids fluttered open, revealing 2 terrified eyes. Dad? He mumbled, his voice weak and shaky, but unmistakably Billy's. Relief washed over me in waves, and I choked back a sob. Billy, it's okay. It's over now, I whispered, cradling him in my arms. His small fingers clung to the fabric of my shirt, a physical reminder that this was my son, my Billy. He was back. In the weeks that followed, life seemed to regain some semblance of normalcy. Our shared ordeal had bound us in ways I couldn't explain, creating a sanctuary of safety and reassurance in each other's presence. We had survived. The changeling was banished, and my son was safe. Or so I thought. A few months later, As I cleaned Billy's room, a piece of paper, tucked away in one of his notebooks, caught my attention. Drawn with a child's hand was a dark figure with inhuman eyes, standing ominously at the foot of a bed. Its long skeletal arm was outstretched towards a small, terrified boy. The image sent a shiver down my spine. "Billy!" I called out, clutching the drawing. He entered, his innocent eyes wide with curiosity. "Dad, what's—" he started, but his words trailed off when he saw the drawing. As I was about to ask him about it, I froze. Billy's feet had lifted off the floor. He hovered in the middle of the room, his eyes wide with fear. "Billy!" I screamed, lunging towards him. But I was too late. His body contorted unnaturally, ripping apart to reveal a swirling vortex. An ungodly scream echoed through the room as the portal swallowed him, then snapped shut, leaving behind nothing but an unbearable silence. My son was gone, taken back into the horrific world from which we thought we had escaped. I hope you enjoyed our episode. I'd like to extend a heartfelt thanks to you, our brave listeners. Your presence in this shared journey into the unknown is what fuels our stories. Your fascination is our motivation. Did this episode send chills down your spine? Leave your comments, share your thoughts, your theories, your own midnight mysteries. Your feedback is the beacon that guides us through the uncharted territories of our stories. And if you haven't already, remember to subscribe to our channel. By joining the Midnight Mystery family, you won't miss out on a single chilling tale. As a subscriber, you'll be the first to know when a new episode lurks around the corner, ready to pull you back into the shadowy depths of the unknown. This is the Midnight Mystery signing off, leaving you with a simple reminder. When the clock strikes 12, fear the silence, for that's when our tales come to life. Good night, Midnight listeners, and remember, not all who wander into the dark are lost.